Do you believe the Chinese government should be in charge of the church? Do you believe you should only pray with people who are your specific branch of Lutheran? If you study denominations, you'll find a lot that are heretical, but many that are not exactly heretical, just weird. First up, we have the African Orthodox Church. Now, there are Eastern and Oriental Orthodox churches in Africa, but that's not what we're talking about here. The African Orthodox Church was actually started over 100 years ago in Boston by black civil rights activists who were part of this Back to Africa movement, where the descendants of freed slaves wanted to move back to Africa. This guy, George McGuire, was ordained a priest in the Episcopal Church, but broke with the Episcopal Church due to its racism and discrimination. He wanted to join Eastern Orthodoxy because he saw it as the only branch of Christianity that didn't have any history of racism or colonization. So he started the African Orthodox Church and actually got apostolic succession from a wandering bishop in the Old Catholic Church. The African Orthodox Church used to have way more members than it does now, and it was a symbol of black civil rights Christianity. However, they are not in communion with mainstream Eastern Orthodoxy, despite holding to Eastern Orthodox theology. Now we have the famous Three Self-Patriotic movement, the state-approved brand of Protestantism in China. But other than this weird detail, it's basically just Chinese Anglicanism, because traditionally in Anglicanism, the church was subject to the king, who was the head of the church. The Three Self-Patriotic movement just replaces the King of England with the government of China. So, if you can get past this weird fact, it's basically a normal branch of Protestantism. They just need to declare allegiance to the Chinese Communist Party, so do with that what you will. But it's not actually a heretical group like you might imagine. They believe in the apostles and Nicene creeds, they preach the gospel, and they administer the sacraments, just like regular Protestant churches. Now we have the Evangelical Orthodox Church. Now, evangelicalism and Eastern Orthodoxy might sound like polar opposites, but this is kind of a fusion of the two. It comes from the Jesus People movement in the 1970s, where a bunch of California hippies became Christian, but wanted to make new forms of Christianity that didn't feel like Christianity. They started Calvary Chapel and invented contemporary worship music to look as untraditionally Christian as possible. But some of these California hippies wanted to become Eastern Orthodox while still keeping some of their evangelical hippie identity. So that's how we got the Evangelical Orthodox Church. A bunch of hippie evangelicals realizing orthodoxy is the true church, but still wanting to stay evangelical, but still wanting to be orthodox. And they hold to orthodox theology but are not in communion with mainstream Eastern Orthodoxy. Make sense? Good. Now let's talk about the new independent fundamental Baptists. So, you know how the true Orthodox split from the Eastern Orthodox because they thought the Eastern Orthodox were getting too liberal? You know how the sedevacantists split from mainstream Catholics because they thought the Catholics were getting too liberal? You know how a lot of conservative Protestant denominations were started because they thought mainline Protestantism was getting too liberal? Well, the NIFB was founded because they somehow thought independent fundamental Baptists were getting too liberal. You heard me right. Somehow they thought independent fundamental Baptists were getting too liberal. So they are known for being very right-wing politically and making very, very controversial statements about homosexuality and a whole host of other issues that gets them in a lot of trouble with the mainstream media. This guy here, Steven Anderson, is basically the face of the whole movement. The Catholic equivalent of Steven Anderson is probably Most Holy Family Monastery, run by the Diamond Brothers. It's a radical sedevacantist group, meaning they think there hasn't been a real pope in a long time, and that Vatican II in the 1960s was the Catholic Church falling into apostasy and abandoning its traditional teaching. They have a very large YouTube channel called Vatican Catholic, explaining how modern Catholicism contradicts traditional Catholicism in many ways. So they are separate from the modern Catholic Church. They run a small monastery in upstate New York, but they say that if you don't have access to this monastery, you can just pray rosaries and you'll be fine. Just like the NIFBs, they're the subject of a lot of controversy because they hold far-right opinions that are not comfortable with the mainstream media. So we talked about the most conservative Catholics, now let's talk about some liberal Catholics. Oh wait, no, that's the regular Catholic Church. We're talking about these people. The American National Catholic Church, a very small church that was founded in New Jersey in 2009. They hold to a lot of traditional Catholic beliefs like apostolic succession, the doctrines about Mary, the papacy, although they believe the Bishop of Rome is more of a first among equals than something infallible, so they'd probably be more like old Catholics in that sense, and of course Catholic doctrine about the sacraments. But they were founded specifically to be a version of the Catholic Church with liberal social beliefs. They support the ordination of women to the priesthood, and they will bless same-sex marriages. So they are very different than traditional Catholicism on social teaching. Next, we have the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod, famously known as the Lutherans who won't pray with you. They're a very historic traditional Lutheran body in the United States, but the reason they're called Wisconsin Synod is because they never united with the other Lutheran synods because they thought everyone else was drifting too liberal, and because Wells has very strict rules about fellowship. They are basically the same in doctrine as other denominations such as the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and about equally conservative. So why are they not united? Because they have different rules about what fellowship means. The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is also very strict about fellowship, but they think that as long as you don't have communion with people outside their church, it doesn't really count as compromising the purity and unity of the church. Whereas the Wisconsin Synod thinks even praying with Christians outside the Wisconsin Synod counts as fellowship outside the bounds of the denomination, and they say that that's not okay. So they keep themselves pure by only praying with other Wisconsin Synod Lutherans. They don't think only Wisconsin Synod Lutherans are saved, but sometimes it sounds that way. Next, we're going to talk about Pietism, which produced the Evangelical Free Church. They're very similar to Baptists, but they actually come from 1600s Lutheranism, because the average sermon in a 1600s Lutheran church was like this. Today, we will be reading from the Holy Scriptures of Johann Gerhard's Lutheran Dogmatics, and we'll be preaching a sermon on the Communicatio Idiomatum and how it serves as a sound refutation of the sacramentarian views of the Eucharist. But how will that help my spiritual life? I just told you. So Pietism was a reaction against the cold intellectualism of late Lutheran scholasticism, and focused more on personal devotion, feelings, and Bible studies. That's right, the Pietists in the 1700s Lutheran churches invented Bible studies. But eventually Pietism became separate from mainstream Lutheranism, especially when it came to America, fleeing persecution from the mainstream Lutheran countries. And they started churches like the Evangelical Free Church. So even though Pietists were originally Lutheran, these days they adopt a lot of Baptist beliefs, like only baptizing adult believers, and thinking communion is mostly symbolic. Now, I hadn't heard of this denomination before researching for this video, but apparently it's got millions of members. The Believers Eastern Church is from India, and it split off from Oriental Protestantism. Let me explain that. In India, there have always been St. Thomas Christians ever since St. Thomas the Apostle went there. Now, most St. Thomas Christians today are under Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Oriental Orthodoxy, or the Assyrian Church of the East. But there have always been some Protestant St. Thomas Christians, mainly Anglicans. Now, the Believers Eastern Church split off from the St. Thomas Anglicans. So these days, they're very Protestant in doctrine, often evangelical or Baptist in doctrine, but very Catholic/Orthodox in their style, aesthetic, and structure. So if you go to one of those churches, the bishop might look like an Orthodox priest, but his sermon might be basically evangelical John MacArthur type stuff. Kind of similar to Mar Mari Emmanuel, if we're being honest. Last, we have the Catholic Apostolic Church, more commonly known as the Irvingites. Now, they're basically Catholic Restorationists. Most people from the Restorationist movement are very low church, like the Disciples of Christ, the Church of Christ, the Seventh-day Adventists, and even the Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. But the Catholic Apostolic Church is very high church. It was started by Edward Irving's followers. Edward Irving was this guy who said we need to rebuild Christianity, just like everyone else in the Restorationist movement thought they were doing. But his followers decided to specifically try and rebuild Catholicism, so what they rebuilt looked a lot more like Catholicism than all the other Restorationist churches. It's very sacramental, even if they don't have the same sacraments as the Catholic Church, and they care a lot about the priesthood. So this shows us that there are some pretty strange combinations of beliefs out there. You have Oriental Protestantism, you have Baptist Lutheranism, you have Evangelical Eastern Orthodoxy, you have Liberal Catholicism, you have extremely fundamentalist Catholicism. But this is what we should expect given how big and influential Christianity has been over the years. Thank you for watching this video. If you want access to some exclusive content or just to support my channel, consider subscribing to my Patreon. You'll get access to all the old live streams as well as some private videos, and depending on what tier you subscribe to, you can request whatever video you want. Also in the description will be the Redeemed Zoom or Discord server, where all denominations are welcome to fellowship and share ideas. However, it's important that if you join, you don't let this replace real-life Christian fellowship, which is why also in the description is a map of traditional Protestant churches for you to attend.